Hello, and welcome to the second part of our Livingston Chapter 10 video here. This one will be nowhere near as long as the last one. We're going to finish up the chapter talking about Confucianism here and make a few conclusions as well. Confucianism starts on 227, and it's not a very long section at all, just a few pages, and you can, hopefully you've read it on your own. I'm going to stress a few of the concepts here, and some of them I probably won't stress as much as the book has, but anyway. In beginning here, we talked about Theravada Buddhism last time, and in the introduction, before we even started talking about Theravada Buddhism in the last video, when we talked about the fact that you're going to find some of these religious or philosophical traditions are going to have something substantial in common, but they also might very much disagree with each other on other issues. And so comparing and contrasting is not as easy as saying, oh, these two are like each other and these two are different. There are things that are going to be very similar and things that are going to be very different in many of these comparison and contrasts. And I mentioned one at the very beginning of the last video that you can take a look at if you'd like. I'm going to mention another one now, and that is we talked about Stoicism in the last video. We also talked about Theravada Buddhism. And interestingly, they have something very much in common. And that is that they both believe that you should accept the inevitability of the way life is. And having done that, you will have a lot less suffering and anxiety and dissatisfaction with life because you don't have unrealistic expectations about what it's supposed to be like. And of course, this is a very important principle in Theravada Buddhism, as we saw in the last video. But also, when we talked about Stoicism in the last video, you'll see that's a very important aspect in Stoicism. So these are two things that you could say that Stoicism and Theravada have in common. On the other hand, what don't they have in common? Well, certainly, Stoicism acknowledges that there is some kind of a divine force. There's some kind of as they would call it, logos, a divine reason, creative force. It's been defined many different ways over the years as the concept has been developed. But Theravada Buddhism certainly would not agree with that in any way, shape, or form. The Buddha doesn't speak about God because it's something that you can't know for sure. He showed how that belief that you have a responsibility from God, especially to preserve your eternal soul, actually exacerbates your existential suffering. And he talks about why, that it actually legitimates the obsession that we have with ourselves. And if you have missed that, I encourage you to go back and look at the last video. But again, here's another contrast that's interesting in terms of what Theravada Buddhism and Stoicism have in common, and in terms of how they very, very much differ from each other. So, and again, I gave you one example at the beginning of the other video. I won't repeat here. Maybe that's because I'm trying to motivate you to watch the other video. Anyway, in Confucianism here, beginning in your book, let's go ahead and put me down in the corner of the screen here. And a few concepts I want to talk about. First of all, before we talk about anything, let me just tell you something about the context. In the time of Confucius, or Confucius, we are in the middle of the Zhou dynasty. Now, the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, in Confucius' respect anyway, he considers to be kind of the golden age, I guess, in ancient Chinese civilization. But by the middle of the Zhou dynasty, he sees that some of the principles, norms, ideals, as far as how someone should live in society and what are the greatest priorities, he sees these things breaking down. And he believes that what needs to happen is that, I say we, but let's put ourselves back 2,500 years ago in China, if we're in his age, we need to go back and relearn some of these ethical and social principles that are so important that we seem to have forgotten in the last few centuries. We need to get back to the way society was in this golden age at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. So he's advocating a return to the traditional social order, a more ethical time, a time when society was much more in harmony and much more just. And so bear that in mind here. As we already mentioned in the last video, Confucius is really not concerned with any kind of individual breaking through to any kind of enlightenment or anything like that, or individual relationship to God that needs to be restored. This is not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is fixing society and fixing humans in terms of their social understanding, their social duties, their relation to society. So this is much more of a social religion, if you want to call it religion. I don't want to get into the debate about whether or not today Confucianism should be referred to as a religion or something else, this kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about here. But it certainly was considered a religion for many centuries. So Confucius is presenting some of these ideas that he thinks that we have forgotten, and he thinks that we need to be re-educated in terms of these social norms and social responsibilities. So I want to talk about a few concepts here that are very, very important. One of them is called Chanming, which is actually the mandate of heaven. And I don't think your book gives you the Chinese term for it, so I don't have it on the slide here either. The mandate of heaven is very similar to the idea of the anointing of leaders in the monotheistic traditions. The term for anointing in Hebrew is Mashiach, and it's where we get the term Messiah. Anybody in Judaism that has an anointing from God, a particular ability to fulfill some special calling and the responsibility to fulfill that special calling, we would say they are anointed. So all kings, prophets, priests, mighty warriors, they're all considered to be anointed by God. And the term Messiah is all the way through the Old Testament of the Bible, or if you're Jewish, through the Tanakh, your scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. But the reason that we don't see the word is because it always seems to be translated as anointed, which is exactly what it means, anointed by God. And that's what Messiah means. So there have been many people that have thought to be anointed in the history of Judaism. Again, kings, prophets, priests. Well, this is very similar in Chinese society at the same time. And what they would call it, if you are a leader or you're in some privileged position in society where you have more responsibility because of your exalted position in society, one would say you have the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is similar to the idea of anointing in that you have been called to a higher responsibility, a higher function, and you have this mandate, this charge, if you will, from heaven to fulfill this higher calling. If you are a king, for instance, heaven has given you authority to rule over the people, but you can't just do whatever you want to do. You have to rule by the ethical principles of heaven. And when we talk about heaven here, we're not talking about heaven the way you might think of it immediately if you're a monotheist, like someplace that people go when they die, that's a wonderful paradise. We're thinking of the kingdom of heaven as an ethical force on the earth. There is an ethical kingdom, and it is ruled by an ethical king, sometimes called the Shangta or the Jade Emperor. I won't ask you about that, but it's an ethical force on earth. So if you had a king, for instance, that received a mandate from heaven, but he was not ruling ethically, he was using his position in an unethical way to try to achieve personal gain, but not fulfilling his responsibility to serve and be a blessing to those under him, heaven might remove his mandate. And of course, there's no way to find out in any objective way whether that's happened or not. But in the ancient understanding, much like the contemporary understanding we have today, if you think that someone has some kind of an anointing or a mandate from God, and all of a sudden something tragic happens to them, they die in battle, they get an incurable disease, someone assassinates them in their bed, people might say, he lost the mandate of heaven. He must have done something unethical. And even if you don't know that there's anything the king has done that is wrong, you would assume that there's something there, or the heaven that had empowered them and given them the mandate would not have allowed them to come to that kind of a tragic end. And this is the same way, not only that people would think about it in, Judaism, ancient Judaism, but also in society today. If you have any kind of a religious system that believes that, if you're in the will of God, and performing, your responsibility to God correctly, there are certain blessings you will see manifested in your life. If you believe that, then when you look at someone and the blessings are clearly not manifest in their life, the question everybody asks is, okay, what are they doing wrong? So The mandate of heaven applies, as we said, especially to rulers, but it also applies to aristocrats, to nobles in the society. The nobles in society are supposed to be more noble. Gee, have you ever thought about that before? When you think of like nobility or the nobles in society, rarely today does that put the idea of, more ethical individuals in anybody's mind. In fact, we often think of the nobility as being maybe a little bit less ethical. If you think of the story of Robin Hood or something like that, where Robin Hood is, stealing from the rich or the aristocracy to feed the poor, the nobles in that story are not noble at all. They don't have these noble qualities. So noble as a characteristic or as an adjective or as an adverb is very different from noble identifying a person in a particular class in society. If you help an old lady across the street that doesn't walk very well and can't see very well, I might say, wow, Joe, that was a very noble thing that you did. And we understand noble in this case is charitable and compassionate and ethical and fulfilling your social responsibility and taking care of people that are less fortunate than you. And we would all say, well done, Joe. But if I talk about somebody being a noble, we don't think of them as being an ethical person at all. And isn't that strange? Well, perhaps the idea is a lot more widespread than it is in Confucianism or in Chinese society, that those who have the greater benefits also have the greater responsibility to serve those under them in society, in some way be a blessing to them. Anyway, in Confucius's time, a lot of the aristocrats are not taking this responsibility seriously. They're not being a good example of living morally or ethically, and they're not fulfilling their responsibility in society. The responsibility of the nobles with the mandate of heaven is to educate the masses in society, educate them in terms of proper ethical practice, educate them in terms of, what is truly valuable, what is truly beautiful, and be an example yourself of living a life where you are conforming to those values, to those, you're representing those qualities. And this is kind of being lost. So what Confucius is doing on so many levels is telling people that they need to get back to the correct idea of who they are and what their function is in society, and they need to start ethically fulfilling it. Now, this concept relates here to the rectification of names, and you'll see this down here under the mandate of heaven. To rectify something is to fix it, to repair it. Name doesn't just refer to the phonetic sounds that people make to get your attention, but your name is more descriptive than that. Your name has to do with who you are in a social sense, in terms of what service you're providing to society, what your responsibility is, what your vocation is. And so, for instance, my name right now might be teacher. Well, there's certainly a right way to teach and a wrong way to teach. There are certain ways that I am supposed to care about my students, or I'm supposed to relate to them. I'm supposed to take seriously my responsibility to them. And if I was not doing that well, you might say, well, he's a bad teacher. I don't like him. So for me, if I was being this bad teacher, what I might need is more personal education as to what it means to be a teacher, to be a good teacher, what my responsibility is. And with this kind of education, I can once again begin to function in the way I'm supposed to. I can once again begin to be a good teacher. I'm rectifying my name. That is my title, the name that describes what I do. I'm fixing that. And so there's a right way to be a business owner. There's a right way to be a public servant. There's a right way, to be a soldier. There's a right way to be an administrator. There's a right way to be any kind of vocation you can imagine. And so rectification of names is fixing who you are, fixing your idea of who you're supposed to be, and beginning to live according to those values and norms and fulfill your responsibility in society. Now, in the rectification of names, in fixing your idea of who you are and how you're supposed to fulfill your social responsibility, Confucianism proposes 5 relationships. And they're all, by the way, very, very well defined in terms of what they're supposed to be, how you're supposed to relate to other people. So these 5 relationships give you an idea of how you're supposed to relate to different kinds of people in society. And the 5 original ones are first of all, the ruler to the subject. You could say, the monarch or the king to the citizen, but it's every person's relationship to the government authority that regulates their life. Next, father to son. And by the way, the reason this is usually talked about as father to son and not mother to daughter is because you don't really see the relationship of a mother to a daughter in society as a whole. It's the men that are seen outside of the home fulfilling their vocational responsibility. It's men that have jobs. It's men that fill government positions. It's men that, lead troops into battle. So people's position in society is determined by the vocation that the man fulfills. So when you talk about the relationship of father to son, this is what would be most observed in the society. Husband to wife, obviously very, very important, and I don't think I need to say much more about that. Elder brother to younger brother, also very important in ancient societies, because if you are the elder brother, you are in a position that has more responsibility than younger brothers. If the father dies, the elder brother assumes the responsibility as the patriarch of the family. He is now the respected leader. And so an older brother does, in a sense, have a greater responsibility, a greater prestige, usually a greater inheritance, and more authority in the family than a younger brother. Lastly, this is worded a number of ways. In your particular book, it talks about elder friend to younger friend, but you will see it as sometimes just elder to younger. Sometimes you'll see it as just friend to friend. But the idea is this is regulating relationships where you're not related to someone by blood. And so obviously if someone is your elder in terms of their position in society, you need to respect them. But this also speaks to peers. Obviously not everybody is your elder or your surrogate or whatever. So if you happen to have people that are at the same level of society, there's a way that they mutually respect each other and interact with each other as well. So these 5 relationships kind of regulate everything about proper social relationships. Now, while you can get every relationship out of pieces of theirs, there are certain relationships that don't clearly fall in any of these categories. So interestingly enough, when Confucianism spreads to Japan, the Japanese Confucianists add 2 more relationships to the 5. And I don't have them up here because I'm probably going to ask you about the 5 relationships. I'm probably not going to ask you about the 2 additional ones. But it's interesting because both of these relationships that the Japanese Confucius add to make 7 kind of normative relationships, the 2 extra ones are things that you all are familiar with. Maybe you can even imagine what they might be. One of them you're experiencing right now. And that would be the relationship from a teacher to a student. Or in this society, you might say more master to disciple, but someone that you are in a position of submission to because they're responsible for teaching you and training you to become who you're supposed to be. And the last one that the Japanese add is the relationship of the employee and the employer, which of course is a very important one today too. Now, in China, in these 5 relationships, you can find all of the information you need, by analogy or a little bit broader application to relate to how an employer should relate to an employee and vice versa, or how a master should relate to a student and vice versa. But again, in Japanese Confucianism, they add the 2 categories that specifically deal with those relationships. So this is what we use to talk about correct relationship in society. So once again, to make a conclusion, before we go to the next slide and the final slide in this, don't have as many slides, we're trying to fix our idea of who we are and what we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to fulfill our relationship in society to get back to a more ethical response to our responsibilities. And the more responsibility we have, the more exalted we are in society, the more we should recognize this as the mandate of heaven. And we should be fulfilling our position as if heaven is requiring it of us, as if heaven has given us a great responsibility and all of the privilege and authority that goes with it. And we had better do our job the right way, the most ethical way, or heaven might remove us from our position, or from our life for that matter. And again, the mandate of heaven, very similar to the idea of the anointing in the monotheistic religions. Moving on here, to the next slide. Let's talk about some Confucian virtues. Now, I have some here that are not talked about in the book, and but I do have a few that are. First of all, Jen is talked about in the book. I don't need to say a whole lot more about it, but let me say a couple things. First of all, sometimes you're going to see Jen as Ren, R-E-N. And in many books, it'll be presented that way. So it's just two different ways that it is transliterated and pronounced. But it means the virtue of humaneness. Not so much humanness. I mean, humans can act in very kind or very cruel ways. But when you talk about being humane, you're generally talking about being kind. You're talking about loving your neighbor as yourself. And conversely, we talk a lot in studying history about man's inhumanity to man, where people are not functioning in that way. I want to talk a little bit more about Li, though. And the book talks about it a lot, and you can read what the book says. And the book does talk about it also as right action. But I want to bring out another aspect of this that the book doesn't bring out quite so much. And that is, well, let's start from the beginning here. Li is propriety. When you say propriety, it comes from the root meaning proper. And it indicates proper action. But it also indicates a proper attitude, because your action is supposed to be the result of your attitude. So it's propriety in both senses. There is no disconnect or duality between, correct idea or correct practice. It's assumed that if your ideas, your attitudes are correct, that your actions will be proper as well. So when we talk about right action, notice I've spelled right two different ways, R-I-G-H-T and R-I-T-E. R-I-G-H-T obviously means correct in an ethical sense. You're making a decision that this is the correct way for you to respond to some situation. The interesting thing is that R-I-G-H-T, correct action, is also right action, R-I-T-E. And R-I-T-E, of course, is the root of the word ritual. A rite is, in fact, a ritual. Now, as the book points out, in ancient times, obviously there are certain ceremonial rites or rituals that are performed, but this doesn't necessarily mean it's a special holy ritual or something like that. Some of these right actions are the kind of things you see all the time in society. They don't take much time to do, but it's just an evidence that you are living according to the correct relationships, and you are showing the correct kind of respect in these different kinds of relationships. Now, let me explain how these work together. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, I was taught that when you meet somebody, you stick out your right hand and say hello, and you shake their hand, pleased to meet you. Why do we do that? I mean, we understand why we do that in terms of, trying to be nice to someone and begin a good relationship. But why is it the right hand that we stick out to shake with them? Why the right hand? Why don't we just kind of like wink at them, or, do what a lot of people are doing today and do elbow bumps, with the COVID-19 pandemic going around? Why do we shake the right hand? Well, this goes way, 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 way back in history. Throughout the Middle Ages, for instance, it is generally thought that the right hand is the more proper hand, is the more holy hand, if you will, and the left hand is the more sinister hand, believe it or not. So if you had a child that was born left-handed, in most societies, they would train the child to become right-handed. It's not okay to be left-handed. Now, you can find a few exceptions to the rule, but by and large, right-handed is the way to go. Which means that if somebody is writing something, they're going to be using their right hand. And also, if somebody is going to be fighting a war, they're probably going to be holding their weapon, whether it's a sword or an axe or whatever, in their right hand as well. Which is why, if you've ever seen medieval castles, I love medieval castles. I've traveled around Germany and Austria and Switzerland looking at them. But it's interesting, when you have a tower and you have a circular staircase that goes up into the tower, they always go in the same direction. If you are going up the staircase, you are constantly turning to your right. And if you are going down the staircase, you are constantly turning to your left. Why is that? Answer is simple. If somebody attacks the castle and breaks into the castle, it is generally going to be the attackers that are going up the stairs, and the defenders are going to be coming down the stairs. And if you are right-handed and you're coming down the stairs, it is a whole lot easier to come around the corner to the left, like this, stabbing around the corner. And if you're coming up, it's very difficult to defend against that. But if you're coming up and you're right-handed, it would be very difficult to be coming up going like this. I mean, obviously you're going to probably have your hands together and you're going to be trying to go like this around the corners, but that's a lot more difficult. And so they're built that way because we expect people, as a rule, to be right-handed in terms of how they've been taught to wield their weapon of warfare. Imagine that you were drawing close to someone who didn't know you or didn't know your intentions, and you wanted to show that person that you were not coming up to them to try to harm them or hurt them with some kind of weapon. You would, show them, that I have nothing in my hand. I have no instrument, getting ready to hurt you. And this is kind of the same reason that, today we would hold up our hands, to show, but look, I have no weapon. You can see my hands. You can see what I'm doing with them. But the right hand would be generally what you would be most interested in seeing if you saw someone you didn't know coming towards you in medieval times. And so blast ahead centuries in the future to the common time, to contemporary period. If I'm reaching out to shake somebody's right hand, what I'm saying, or what I should be saying, we've certainly lost the meaning of this, but what I'm really saying is, hello, it's nice to meet you. I wish you all the best. I hope that our relationship will be a good one and that we can benefit each other. And I have no desire to hurt you whatsoever, And of course, many people are very disingenuous. And as they're shaking their right hands going, pleased to meet you, in their mind, they might be saying, yes, sucker, I'm going to take everything you got. Because people are disingenuous. But it's supposed to indicate that you mean no harm, that you mean only the best for the person. So that's where we get the idea. So the correct attitude would be wanting to be a blessing and not wanting to damage someone else. But, and while that is the RIGHT, right attitude, the shaking of the hand, if you will, is the RITE, right action to demonstrate that attitude. Make sense? And so, for instance, give you an example more from the period contemporaneous of what we're talking about. Imagine you were, coming up a path to the city or whatever, and you saw an elder of society coming down the path. Well, you might step off of the path to let the elder pass, and as they pass, bow before them. So in this case, the correct attitude would be respect for the elder, the right RIGHT attitude. But the right, RITE, ritual action that you do, the habitual action that you have learned to demonstrate your respect, is that you bow. That makes sense? So it's right to have respect, RIGHT, but to show the respect, you engage in the RITE, the learned habitual action of bowing to demonstrate your respect. So that's the one thing I wanted to bring out here that maybe the book didn't quite bring out quite so much. The book, I don't think, talks about shu. But I'm going to because it's important. Shu means reciprocity. And reciprocity is, of course, how you respond to good or bad actions from other people. If somebody comes up to me and slaps me in the face and I reciprocate, what am I doing? I'm slapping them back, If somebody does me a favor and I reciprocate, what does that mean? It means I'm doing a favor for them. So that's what we mean by reciprocal action. Now, let's stop for a moment and think about the golden rule. And it can be stated in different ways. We know that in Judaism and in Jesus' teachings, the second great commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And in terms of the golden rule, that is usually said that, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Or it can be inversely stated, that which is grievous to you, don't do to another. That which you wouldn't want happening to you, don't, make that happen to someone else. We understand this. Now, there's more to this, though. To begin the explanation, there's a joke sometimes, and maybe you've heard it. And the joke is, instead of do unto others as they do unto you, people will cynically and for the sake of a laugh, say, do unto others before they do unto you. And what they're usually meaning is, take advantage of them before they can take advantage of you, because it's all some big competition here. Now, obviously, that's not correct, but there is an ethical sense that you can apply that. Do unto others before they do unto you. In other words, don't wait until someone does something good to you and then do good to them in reciprocation. Instead, you be the first one to do good. So in other words, you are going to do the action to other people that you would like to see them reciprocate. And that really is the golden rule, first step. So if I would rather you be nice to me, I'll be nice to you first, and hopefully you'll reciprocate and be nice to me. But here's the thing that's interesting. Maybe you'll never see me again. Maybe you won't be able to reciprocate to me for the goodness I've shown you. But we have this idea of what is just in us. And when someone has done something really good to us, shown us a favor, something in us, assuming we're ethical people and not sociopaths or deeply damaged, something in us says that, I have to pay it back. And if I can't pay it back to the person who did me the good, what am I going to do? I'm going to try to pay it back to someone else. We call that paying it forward. Someone does you something, does you a solid, then you want to go and do a solid for someone else. That's reciprocal action to someone different. Now, this is where Shu is very, very important. And that is, we can affect many, many, many people we will never see or never meet simply by the way we might treat one person. Imagine rush hour traffic in the morning if you happen to live in an urban area. It's a very frustrating thing sometimes, especially if somebody's had an accident or their car's broken down. And some people get very angry and they don't deal with this in a good way. And even good people get downright mean on the road sometimes when they're frustrated. And there are people who leave their house to go to work in the morning or whenever you go to work in a very good attitude. But by the time they get to work, perhaps they're really, really annoyed because of the way they've been treated on the road. And I'm sure all of us can relate to this. So because, one person maybe cut you off or screamed at you or flipped you off or whatever, it puts you in a bad mood and you end up, treating other people with disrespect, and it just screws up your whole attitude, right? It can have an effect. But it also works the other way. Imagine that you're in rush hour traffic and you see some poor lady, on the side of the road, wanting to get into traffic, and everybody's frustrated. Nobody wants to let her in. She's going to sit there for a long time. And you see her and so you go ahead and slow down and you kind of wave her in, come on in. The guy behind you is probably honking, you can flip him off. But you're doing the good for the woman in front of you. You're letting her into traffic and she waves and she's, how appreciative, Now, my question is this: if a couple blocks down the street, this same lady sees someone on the side of the road in a similar predicament who needs to be let into traffic, is she not more likely to let them into traffic? Yes, she's paying it forward. Now, you may not see this. The point is, your action of goodness, your action of kindness, might actually result in actions of kindness being shown to many, many, many other people that you never, ever, ever will see. Because of the kindness you show to one or two people, they may go on to show kindness to many, many other people. So by doing to others what you would rather have them do to you, you're starting a whole chain of reciprocal action that can affect multitudes of people. And so that's a very, very good way of looking at the golden rule. It's not just about how you respond to things or even, just doing something because on some ethical sense it's the right thing to do. But in a practical sense, you are actually going to produce good actions towards other people because the people you bless are going to have this ethical sense in them that they need to pay it forward. The next term, shao here, the book doesn't give you the term, but it does talk about filial piety. And this is proper respect to the people you are affiliated with. When you think of filial, you can think about the root of being affiliated. However, most of the time we talk about filial piety, we're talking about families, that kind of affiliation. So, filial piety, you could also say familial piety. So it's the proper respect. And we talked about this with the 5 relationships, whether it's people that are related to you or people that aren't. And the book talks about it as well, so I'm going to leave that. Let's go on to when. The book doesn't talk about this. These are the arts of peace. Now, here's one of the things that's really interesting about Confucianism, and one of the things I like the most about Confucius, and obviously I'm involved in education, actually higher education, and so this, to me, is something very, very important. And that is, if you happen to be in a position in society where you're one of the ones that have been educated, usually this means that you're one of the aristocrats. You're one of the ones that is supposed to be being not only a good example, but educating people under you in society. And one of the things that you are educating them in terms of is the arts. appreciation of the arts. And by the way, there's obviously arts of war too, necessary to protect society. But in this case, we're talking about the arts of peace. And immediately when people think of the arts, they might think of, oil paintings or statues, but obviously there's so many things that fall in this category, from, music to architecture to gardening to philosophy. All of these are arts. And the fact of the matter is, societies that promote the arts tend to be more peaceful societies. Two guys coming out of an art museum are less likely to get into a disagreement or a fight than two guys coming out of a topless bar. It's a fact, right? So when you promote the arts, you promote a peaceful society. And one of the reasons this is important to me is we live in an age now where obviously we have a huge deficit. And a lot of people, including myself, believe that fiscal responsibility is something we should keep in mind. And so a lot of, political candidates or whatever are talking about how they would like to balance the budget or how they would like to cut excessive spending in certain areas. The problem is, what areas are you going to cut it in? And just to make it very, very brief for me personally, if you are cutting funding that is spent for public education, or you're cutting public funding for social service programs or, programs for the elderly or something like that, I'm not going to vote for you. I don't care what party you belong to. If you talk, about cutting funds that would promote education and promote relief for people who are disadvantaged, you've lost me. Okay, we don't cut those kind of programs, in my opinion. That's not, if the funds are being misadministered or there's corruption in the administration, yes, we've got to fix that swiftly. But we don't take away funding because a few people are abusing it. Just because you've been kind to somebody and they've abused your kindness doesn't mean you stop being kind, right? There's always people that are going to abuse things. So when I was a kid, we had programs in the school that I went to, and granted, I grew up in a fairly well-to-do neighborhood, rich white kid and all of that, though I rebelled against that whole society as an early teenager. And you may have heard me tell some stories about that before. Nonetheless, in my school, they had all kinds of programs. My sister and I both had foreign language programs. I was learning Spanish. She was learning French in elementary school. We had band programs, and I remember I was learning to play the clarinet at one point, and I didn't continue with that, continued with other instruments. And, you could rent band instruments if you couldn't afford to buy one, and this is a wonderful thing. Now, in many schools that, are in poorer neighborhoods, a lot of these programs, when the government cut funding for them, again, in the under the auspices of balancing the budget or whatever, those programs just couldn't receive funding from anywhere else. And if you happen to be in an inner city school or something and they have any kind of program like that at all, there's a good chance that there's some kind of outside funding from some kind of a beneficiary, from some kind of altruistic, millionaire that's trying to give back to society. But if you're in a poor neighborhood, those music programs and so on have probably been cut out of your school, in some cases decades ago. Why are we doing that? How many kids growing up in the inner city avoided the inevitability of being involved in gangs because they found out they were good at playing the violin or something like that? These programs really are important. Now, from the time I was young, and granted I'm really old, but the world is a lot more dangerous and violent than it was then. When I was a kid, I rode the bus to school by myself. I could walk to school if I wanted. I could ride my bike. Nobody was worried about me getting kidnapped. Point is, it was a different world. Nowadays, we see on the news quite often, at least in the city where I live, you see people trying to abduct children from the school bus stop, sometimes right in front of the kid's home. You see somebody drive up in a nondescript van trying to muscle the kids into the van and abduct them. That stuff just didn't happen. At least it was extremely, extremely rare when I was a child. So it is a much more dangerous, much more violent society in many ways than it was. And some of that has to do with the fact that we no longer are promoting the arts. Another example of this is the focus on STEM subjects. I agree that science and technology and engineering and mathematics are very, very important. But if people that are majoring in these areas have no understanding of humanities or philosophy or religious studies or history, if they've never had to look at man's inhumanity to man, if they've never had to ask themselves, what is a human life worth? If they've never been challenged in these areas, how comfortable are you with the fact that they're building new forms of weapons, or that they are responsible for the financial decisions that your society is making? Do you really want people that haven't been challenged in these kind of ethical ways to be able to be making decisions, in these areas? Not me. So I think even in the school system today, we have an idealism that STEM is all that's important. The governor in our state, he's not the governor anymore. He finished his 2 terms and now he's a U.S. senator. But when he was the governor in this state, one of the things that he said in an early speech that was repeated more than once was that he thought that financial aid for students should be restricted to those who were getting degrees in STEM subjects that actually were worthwhile. And why are we spending so much money, for students to get degrees in things like English and history and anthropology and things that are just, of no value? Wow. Now, the backlash against that statement was huge. And he learned not to say that anymore. Certainly didn't change his mind, but he learned to not articulate that particular viewpoint that he held. In fact, the University of South Florida's anthropology department created a big website with many, many testimonials from students that had graduated with majors in anthropology, not just from USF, but from other schools as well, talking about what they were doing with those degrees and the companies they worked for. And, these anthropologists were saying, wait. Before you say that our degree, is not needed and it has no value, let's tell you who's looking for people with this kind of understanding and what kind of value we are providing. And it was a great response. I was proud of the department for doing that. But that's another attitude today. So because of this, and obviously all of those things, by the way, when you talk about philosophy, you talk about humanities, you talk about religious studies, these fall into the category of the arts of peace. And we should be promoting these if we want our society to be more peaceful. And our society is becoming less and less peaceful because less and less we're promoting the arts of peace. The book talks a lot about the virtuous power of da. And it sounds like a strange way to pronounce this. Probably not completely correct, but it's about as close as an Anglo like me can get to the Chinese pronunciation. But this virtuous power, the book actually talks quite a bit about on page, let's see here, 231, the last page of the chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and let you read what the book says about this. The book also talks about the shunsa. And by the way, there's 2 different ways of translating Chinese words. So you'll sometimes see them spelled in different ways. You'll sometimes see shunsa spelled as Junzi. No hyphen, just one word. That's the more modern way of translating this word. But this is the person who is an example. Originally, it's the noble and virtuous gentleman, okay? Again, a noble is supposed to be someone who is more noble, who's an example of nobility. Shame that it's not that way and hasn't been for a long time. And when you talk about a noble, you're talking about someone that's noble. Likewise, a gentleman. Ladies and gentlemen, what does that mean? Gentleman means a gentle man. The man is not going to be violent. He's not going to start a fight. He's learned how to live in a peaceful and sophisticated way. And I mean sophisticated in the healthiest application of that word. He's a gentle man. We don't think about him. It says, ladies and gentlemen. Who thinks about the fact, these are all gentlemen here? We've lost the meaning of that too. So the shunsa is the example. The person who's ethical. The person who is fulfilling their role in society isn't in an ethical way, and especially seeing that they have the responsibility to serve those that are below them in society. They have a responsibility to do that. They are gentle men. They are those who appreciate ethics and aesthetics, and they value those things that are most moral and those things that are most beautiful and most noble and most true. And so the shunsa is the term that describes that perfect person, if you will. Well, that's about all I have to say on Confucianism here. Again, you're going to have a quiz. on the entire Livingston chapter 10, and there was a lot to talk about, so that's why we have two videos here. This one's not nearly as long as the first one, thankfully. There will be a quiz on the first video, which is the introduction to the chapter, talking briefly about Marxism, and which isn't addressed later on in the chapter, and then going on and talking about Christianity a little bit, talking about Stoicism, that particular philosophy, and then most of the first video spent on talking about Theravada Buddhism. This one, of course, on Confucianism. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope that some of these ethical ideals, if you will, have inspired you a little bit to be a better person. And again, you'll have a quiz on both of these videos that'll be available for you to demonstrate your understanding of some of these concepts. All right. See you next time.